Dr. Holden, you've been studying NDEs for what seems to be about 30 years now, and it's quite a lot of time. Could you tell me how your interest in this lesser known area at the time began, and how did you get started in this field?
Yeah. Well, thank you first for having me here, Sabrina. And I, growing up, I was always interested in phenomena that were not easily explained, and I also grew up in a liberal Lutheran church, so I had a kind of religious perspective. And when I was an undergraduate, my father gave me a book to read called The Great Soul Trial. And it's a book about a reclusive miner from Arizona who disappeared and left several $100,000 for research on the survival of the human soul after death. And the state of Arizona had to actually hold a trial where everybody who wanted to claim the money could come and testify why they deserved it. And so the book is a lot of the court testimony of like the research director for the American Society for Psychical Research, the Psychical Research Foundation, and like that, talking about how they would research the survival of the human soul after death. And that was in probably around 1970. Well, 15 years later, I was working on completing my doctoral degree, and we have to do a dissertation. And long story short, I ended up doing my dissertation on a topic related to near-death experiences. And once I delved into the topic, I was just enthralled with it, and I have never stopped. And I should say that in 1978, I read Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, that opened the field of near-death studies. And that kind of set me up so that when it came time for my dissertation, that was what I ended up doing the research on. So, and I've just been fascinated by it ever since, and have really focused my research on near-death experiences. And there are a lot of related experiences that occur in near-death experiences. For me, most notably after-death communication with deceased loved ones. And so that's another topic that I've done research on related.
I understand. And I think that's so interesting because, back in 78, when you were doing your doctorate degree on this, I can imagine it wasn't as popular as it is today, even though today it's not so much in the mainstream. So how was it perceived by, people around you when you were talking about your doctorate or your thesis?
Yeah. Well, you're so right, Sabrina, that at that time, near-death experiences were a little-known phenomenon. And in retrospect, I really believe that I was guided in many ways throughout my life to be able to focus on this area of research. And one of the ways was that I was at a university in a counseling program that was very liberal and open-minded. So and in fact they're taught courses on the transpersonal perspective in education and counseling, which is about near-death experiences, after-death communication, past life memories, out-of-body experiences, psychic phenomena, all of those things. So I was in an academic environment that was open to the topic. So I was just I didn't. Well, I sort of chose it because of that. After I finished my master's degree, I thought I was finished with education. And then one day I was looking at the catalog and saw this course on the transpersonal perspective and thought, oh, I'm just going to go back and take that one class. And as a result, I launched into my whole doctoral degree and then ended up doing a dissertation in that area. So I was just fortunate that there was, because courses like that are few and far between even today. So I was just fortunate that there was a course like that nearby.
It definitely sounds like you were at the right time at the right place, and
Exactly.
that it was almost, as you say, you were being guided towards it, or it was just put aside for you.
That's right. That's right.
So when we talk about NDEs, what I've noticed is, of course, everybody has their own experience and it is unique to them. But some people will experience a life review, others will not. Some will get to see loved ones, others will not. Some get to see the Creator, God, Jesus, others won't. So, is there any kind of classification that I can think of when we're thinking about NDEs?
Well, it's a great question, and just to make sure that everyone that we're all on the same page about what an NDE is, these experiences occur probably most reliably during a close brush with death, but they can occur in other extreme circumstances. And what happens is during the extreme circumstance, the person experiences themselves, they may experience their consciousness leaving their body, and then their consciousness observing the material world from a position outside their body, and then moving to domains and interacting with entities, beings that are not of the material world, and then returning back to their physical body. Now, not everybody has all of those elements. And within each of those elements, especially what I call the material aspect, where the person is observing the material world, uh, and then there's the transmaterial aspect, where they're in environments with entities that are not of the material world. There are a lot of features in both of those. So, in the material aspect, the person, first of all, people say overall that NDEs tend to be realer than real, that the experience is as real or more real than reality feels when we're in our physical bodies. And they also say that the experience is very difficult to explain. It's ineffable because they're experiencing phenomena that are beyond what our normal physical experience is. And language was designed to navigate normal physical experience, not things beyond it. So it's usually, they say it's really hard to explain, but they do their best nevertheless. And also, I think it's important for people to know that near-death experiencers tend to say that however long ago the experience occurred, it feels like it was just yesterday. The memory is extremely clear to them, even decades later. It just sticks with them. And there's been research actually asking people to describe their NDE when they had it, and then again like 30 years later, and they describe it in almost exactly the same terms. So it's a very stable, clear, lasting memory. So anyway, in the material aspect, the person's perception is what I like to call normal plus. So they can both see the material world, and a blue top will still look like a blue top. You'll still be recognizable as Sabrina, and all those sorts of things. And the person can both see and see through solid objects like walls. People can see in the distance through walls. They move at the speed of thought. So they think something and zoom, they're there. And and they can not only see but often hear what's happening, and hear the thoughts of the people in the environment. So it's a very unusual state of consciousness. And there's more to say about that aspect, but I'll move to the transmaterial aspect. Usually, the transition between the material and the transmaterial is some kind of rapid movement through space or an enclosure. A lot of people in the Western world report moving rapidly through a tunnel, but no two people describe the tunnel the same way. So it's still individualized, and then they might find themselves in a preternatural environment that has trees and flowers that are earth-like but way beyond anything, colors that were not seen on earth, consciousness of every blade of grass, just things that are just not normal for when we're in our bodies. And then they may meet entities, deceased loved ones, spiritual entities. And so we don't know. All the research that we've done hasn't clarified to us why some people have a relatively shallow experience with just one or two of those features. Other people have a deep experience with prolonged conversations with spiritual entities and things like that. We don't know what the difference is there. And all we know is that these features appear. If you look at hundreds of near-death experiences, you'll see these features reappearing in different people's experiences. And one of the things that I've concluded, and a researcher named Gregory Shushan independently concluded the same thing, is that we look at NDEs at kind of like three levels. There's a universal level where these recurring features occur. So there's, no matter whether you're talking about an NDE from today or from 1,000 years ago, or an NDE from the West or the East, you're going to find certain universal features like rapid movement through a space, interaction with beings not of the material world, and perception of the material world from a position outside the body. These kinds of things, they're very generic, but you find them across cultures and throughout history. And then from that universal level, the next level is how those universal features reveal themselves related to culture. And so in the West, as I mentioned, a lot of people talk about moving rapidly through a tunnel. In the East, the movement may be different. Like there's a woman from New Zealand who had a near-death experience, and in her NDE, she flew over Aotearoa, which is the Maori name for New Zealand, toward the jumping off place of souls. So there was still rapid movement, but it was of a different cultural nature. And then there's one more level where that expresses itself individually. So as I mentioned, even in the West, the tunnel, no two individuals describe the tunnel the same way. One person will say it was a dark tunnel with light at the end. Another will say that it was a tunnel of light, but one person might say it was white light. Another person might say it was blue light. It was multicolored. Sometimes beings are in the tunnel, sometimes not. So what we like to say is that culture seems to influence the form that the experience takes, or the way that the person interprets what they experienced. But it doesn't determine the basic features of the experience. The basic features seem to be universal. They express themselves culturally and then individually at those. So it has those kind of three levels. I don't know if that answered your question, but
absolutely.
okay.
And I love, to be honest, I'm a big fan of research and anything that can be quantified. So I really love understanding more, and also I think also understanding more of your vocabulary and the way you're generalizing it, because I'm coming from the perspective of having heard NDEs and then you have a very well encompassing view, and it helps me process what I've learned. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Now, when you mentioned the woman in New Zealand, you've mentioned she was going or taken to the jumping off point for souls. Now, I have heard in some NDEs or out of body experiences that some people report having seen almost a queue of souls waiting to be born into the world, or a queue of souls leaving. Is that it's very difficult for me to wrap my mind around that. So are there energetic points, or sort of like we would go to a train station if we want to take a train, or we would go to an airport if we want to take a plane? Are there some spaces where these things happen, or do you have any more insight based on your research on how that gets to happen? How do we come into the world, and how do we leave the world?
No, I can't say that I have research on that. Just that people do report. I mean, and we're getting into a related area, which is the whole question of incarnation and reincarnation. And all I can say is that some people report actual memory of entering a baby's body or that sort of thing. And some people report the experience in near-death experiences of leaving their physical body. So we don't know how or why that happens. We just know that people report it.
Okay. And when we talk about this other side, or another dimension, if you will, the place where we go, where the consciousness goes when we have an NDE or when we pass away, some people describe it as heaven. Others just describe it as, this other plane. How do you see it? So what's happening outside of this world?
Yeah, I think you're making a really good observation that people use the language to describe their experience that they have at hand. And for some people who have maybe been raised religious, they may label the place that they were as heaven. Some people will just describe it without giving it a label per se. And that's again that cultural level where if you just ask people what they experienced without labeling it or putting any interpretation, there tends to be similarity, but how they interpret it, how they label it, is part of their cultural the cultural aspect that they bring to the experience. So it just depends on the person's cultural background.
Okay, absolutely. So one of the things that I don't know if you have a scientific answer to it, but I was very curious what your opinion on it was, is that I noticed that a lot of people connect with NDEs on a very profound level. And we can see that, by the amount of people watching NDE videos, being interested in NDE stories, people that haven't had NDEs. And one of my not scientific takeaways is that it seems to give a larger meaning to life, and it seems to give a frame of purpose to whatever it is that we're going through. So whether we're going through a personal challenge, whether there's anything that can be going on, it's almost like we get this frame of looking beyond the immediate challenge and seeing that there must be a purpose because we see ourselves in other people. But I've been fascinated by the way that people navigating health, financial issues, grief, are just connecting with these NDE experiencers. So what are your thoughts on why do we connect so much with these stories, and how do you think it impacts everybody that comes in contact with this field?
Well, I think near-death experiences are interesting to people for several reasons. Probably the most fundamental is that each of us is going to die someday. And the big question of what happens to us when we die. And the best testimony we have is from people who approached physical death, and especially people who had moments of cardiac arrest, um, and were actually clinically dead for some time. And we have some cases of people who were dead for a long time. Like, for example, Mary Neal was underwater for 30 minutes. So she was definitely, not breathing and dead by all measures. And so I think it addresses that question of what happens to us when we die. Also, however, most near-death experiencers come back with the sense, the conviction that we are each here on earth for a reason. Our lives have purpose, and the big purpose is to advance in our capacity to love, to become more loving, and also to acquire knowledge. Learning somehow seems to be an important function of life. So loving and learning, in that order though, loving first. So interestingly, people who had a near-death experience associated with a suicide attempt particularly come back with the sense that when we face challenges in life, we're meant to see them through. And it's through facing those challenges that we do advance in our capacity to love. I don't know if this is true for you, but the times that I've been, excuse me. Okay, I'll start again. So I don't know if this is true for you, but the times that I've been in the most emotional pain, I've also been the most empathic and caring about other people. And so our challenges really have the potential to enhance our compassion and caring for others. And we're meant to ride those experiences through. And a lot of people who've had an NDE through associated with a suicide attempt say that they discovered that they weren't going to get punished per se. It's just that they got the sense that if they left life now with the problems that they have, they have the sense that they're going to reincarnate and face the same challenges in the future life. So they have a choice of either facing it now or facing it later, and that those challenges are there for our spiritual development. So NDEs not only provide some glimpse into what happens when we die, but they also provide a sense of meaning and purpose in life.
It seems like every challenge we have is bringing us to a lesson that we're supposed to learn. So that would mean that we're not going through difficulties and being given challenges just for, the sake of it or because life is hard, but because we're supposed to be better for it and we're supposed to learn. So because you mentioned this twofold purpose, which is loving more and being more loving as we can be, but then also knowledge, how much of the knowledge that you're referring to in this purpose is actually the knowledge acquired by the challenges we undergo? Or how do you define that knowledge?
Yeah, I guess I would say that there's an emotional learning from life challenges, which speaks to the loving aspect, developing our capacity to love. And then there's the informational learning, which is that apparently in some way it is helpful for us to acquire literal knowledge, math, science, whatever. And so that somehow when we learn information, it contributes to some repository that's universal. I don't pretend to understand that. I'm just trying to convey the sense that NDEers have conveyed to me. So yeah, so that's it.
That's so interesting. Now, I wanted to talk a bit more about the after effects of NDE experiencers, also from the perspective of people who have had NDEs and are afraid to share them with family, with loved ones, because they don't feel understood, or, perhaps there's been a comment, they've tried to, and then they shut down. How can we, if we've had an NDE, or if somebody in our life has had an NDE, how can we best support them through these after effects?
So those are two big questions. First, about after effects. So we talked about how NDEs can vary in their depth. Some can have just one or two features. Some can have that are not very intense. Others can have many features that are very intense and elaborate. And the deeper the more intense the NDE, the more intense the after effects in general. And the after effects I like to characterize like there's um, a convention in writing letters. Afterwards, you put a PS, and after the letter. So this is after the experience, characterizing the after effects as PSPS. And the first P is psychological. So people become less materialistic, more concerned about others. They become committed to nonviolence. They lose their fear of death because they know from experience that their consciousness continued to function when their body was, in many cases, clinically dead. And other like value changes that are psychological in nature. And then there's more to all of these, but I'm just going to hit just to give an overview. The first S is spiritual, and people become much more interested in spirituality. They become usually less religious, but more spiritual. But some people become more religious. So this isn't, across the board. But there's a tendency for people to just find, not that they disagree or condemn religion, but they find that it's just not big enough to accommodate what they now know. So, and people develop what in some contexts are called spiritual gifts. They develop the ability to see the future. They can now communicate with deceased entities. They know what other people are experiencing without the other person telling them. And these are, what have been called psychic or paranormal abilities. And then the next P is physical, and people actually change physically. They say that their metabolism is different. They may require less food, less sleep. They become more sensitive to environmental things like sound and light, but also to medication, so that they only have to take half as much of something to get the same effect as from before their near-death experience. And an interesting physical after effect is the electromagnetic effects, which is that when the NDE, especially when they become emotionally aroused, the electronic things in their environment malfunction. And there's actual research on this, that near-death experiencers report this significantly more than people who haven't had a near-death experience. Their cell phones cut out, their computers crash. I knew an NDEer who, she and her boyfriend who lived together had just bought a new TV, and he observed that whenever she walked in the room, nobody was touching the remote, but the TV would change channels and the volume would go up and down just when she was in the room. So, and light bulbs go out. I know an NDEer who was in a counseling session as the client. She was talking about something very emotional, and in the lamp right next to her head, the light bulb exploded. And so things can, very dramatic things can happen, but usually it's more low key. And then the final S is social. So you can imagine if a person was one way, then they have a near-death experience and they're suddenly having all these after effects, and they themselves feel transformed. They feel fundamentally different than they felt before their NDE. That's going to reverberate in their social life. So if someone's married at the time of an NDE, they're more likely to become divorced. And we know that that's because their values, the two spouses' values that usually are fairly parallel when people get together, the NDEers' values diverge and become, like less materialistic, less violent, and all that, which is very counter to Western culture, and they may divorce. Whereas there are a few cases where the other spouse was already more NDE-like in their values. So when this person has their NDEs, their values converge, and those couples continue happier than ever. But they're the minority. The majority are more prone to divorce. And that's not to say there's some people manage to stay together despite their differences because of some shared values about family and faithfulness and things like that. So not everybody. We're just talking about tendencies here. People change their vocations. There is a great case of a man who was a hitman for the mafia, had a near-death experience, and became a high school teacher. And people move into vocations that are more service oriented, like education and healthcare and things like that. So, and people change their affiliations to organizations and so forth because they find they don't relate to the values of an organization that they did relate to prior to their near-death experience. So there are psychological, spiritual, physical, and then social after effects. And these can be very challenging. Because these people have temporarily entered what feel like, as you've said, other dimensions of reality, many of the people around them can't relate to that. And they realized that before their NDE, they couldn't have related to it either. But now they have this broader perspective. So they many times feel very transformed by the experience, and because others around them may not be able to relate, they oftentimes are either reluctant to share their experience, or they have experiences of sharing that are painful and harmful to them. And what makes a disclosure experience harmful, we know from research, is if the confidant, the person who's listening, doesn't recognize what the person had as an NDE, or recognizes it as an NDE but dismisses the importance of it, or diagnoses the person as mentally ill, or demonizes the experience as somehow being evil or of the devil. These are what I call the Ds: deny, dismiss, diagnose, and demonize. And just the opposite is what's helpful. If the listener can say, oh, it sounds like you had what is some people refer to as a near-death experience. And I wouldn't force that label on somebody, but many people find it really helpful to know that what they experienced, they're not alone. It's a thing that other people have experienced. And so that's the acknowledgement of the that it's potentially an NDE. And then recognizing the importance of the experience, that a lot of people who have this experience, they feel really profoundly changed by it, and acknowledging that to the NDEer. And then there is absolutely no relationship between near-death experiences and mental disorder. We know this very clearly from research. And it doesn't mean that people with mental disorders don't have NDEs. They do, but they have them at the same rate as people without mental disorders. So there's just no relationship to mental disorder. And in terms of these experiences being somehow evil or of the devil, these experiences engender in people what, in at least one litmus test from the Bible, says that the fruit of the Spirit, meaning if something derives from Spirit, then it engenders these after effects. And they are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. These are all things that near-death experiencers increase in following their NDEs, generally speaking. And so from that, using that one biblical litmus test, these experiences are of Holy Spirit, so to speak, rather than being in some way evil or of the devil or that sort of thing. So the best way that someone can help an NDEer is to acknowledge the NDE, acknowledge its importance, know that the person is not mentally ill related to just disclosing this experience, and that the experience is, I've made up a word, numinous, meaning that the word, I didn't make up the word numinous. Numinous means of spirit. And these NDEs are numinous.
Absolutely. I think that's a good word to use that I didn't know before.
Yeah.
And I think it's also really valid advice and really good tips for how to handle our own NDE, or somebody close by having it. I think nowadays with most things, right, when somebody comes to talk to you about something, we would tend to give a solution, give advice, and say, you have to do this, or no, that wasn't right, you didn't get it. And I think just holding space essentially and not being dismissive. Because what I often also say on the channel is these experiences and sharing them is something that takes a lot of vulnerability. So it's not like discussing the football game of yesterday. So I do believe that we need to just act as kindly and generously as we can, and lovingly, especially with.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you brought up an important point that I didn't give enough attention to, which is not to interpret the experience for the person, but to repeatedly inquire into what the experience means to the person. And so that's a really important aspect of responding helpfully.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Now, I was wondering, because you've had so many years of research in this field, and it is definitely an area that cannot not affect you personally, because you tend to take your work home with you a lot with these kinds of things. And I find that I think about it more often than not, and it has helped me think of the greater questions in life as opposed to what shoes do I want to buy. Not that I'm that superficial, but you get what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
How has it impacted your personal life, and how have you changed as a person since working with NDE?
Well, to answer that question, I'm going to divert for a minute to a topic within the field of near-death studies, which is veridical perception in NDEs. And this refers to cases in which, during the NDE, the person perceived things that were not known to them in their normal physical life, but are later verified as accurate. And so, for example, one man was in surgery, and his heart stopped, and he left his body. He watched as the medical team resuscitated him, and he noticed that the way he described it later was that his surgeon, who he recognized, was flapping his arms as if trying to fly. And when they resuscitated him, he was anesthetized the whole time, never awoke physically, and then finished the surgery. He went into post-op, and there he regained consciousness, and he told his nurse what he had seen. This happened at the University of Virginia, where the leading researcher of NDEs, Bruce Grayson, was on the psychiatrist on the medical staff. And she called him and she said, I have a patient who had one of those things that you study. So he came right over and interviewed the guy right away, and then went about interviewing each of the people in the medical team over the next few days, ending up with the doctor. And everybody said the same thing about this doctor, that he did do this thing, but he explained it. He had been trained internationally, and there they trained the doctor that once you sterilize your hands, you put them on your sterile gown, and then you back into the operating room and you wait as your team does all the preparatory work. And then when it's time for you to do it, only then do you take your hands down and start working on the patient. So while he was standing there, the patient went into cardiac arrest. So he was saying, get that scalpel, move that tray. He was pointing with his elbows, which to the near-death experiencer who's up here at the ceiling watching all this, looks like he's like flapping his arms as if trying to fly. So it was very idiosyncratic, something that no one ever talked about. It was just kind of only when they were interviewed did people say, well, oh, yeah, Dr. So-and-so does that, And so there's no way for the patient to have known that except that his consciousness actually was out of his body observing the events. Well, about 125 cases like this have been collected in a book called The Self Does Not Die. And these are verified paranormal phenomena from near-death experiences. And these together, they point to that the NDEs are not just an experience that feel absolutely real. There's evidence to indicate that people are experiencing what they say they're experiencing. And that has had a very strong impact on me. And that's part of why I've focused on veridical perception in my research, because not only does it make the experiences more believable, but it makes the messages of them more believable. It's one thing for somebody to have this experience and come back and say, we're really here on earth to develop our capacity to love. And everybody goes, okay, fine. But if the experience was real, then that message carries a lot more weight. And so I have personally been affected. You mentioned the life review. That's probably about a third of near-death experiencers report that in the transmaterial aspect, they reviewed and re-experienced usually every moment of their life and experienced being on the receiving end of their actions, not just imagining what that was like, but actually being the other person. So what NDEers would say is that someday you and I are each going to relive this moment, and I will know what it is to be you, and you will know what it is to be me. So that means whatever I'm doing to another person, I'm doing to myself. I am that other person at another level. And so it affects my choices about how I relate to people moment to moment. And it affects my political decisions, whether a potential political leader seems to be empathic and compassionate and genuinely dedicated to the well-being of others. So it affects me from every level, from moment to moment interactions to, my big policy decisions in life.
I think it's so beautifully worded. And I do think that once you know or you're exposed to this field and to the experiences of not one but so many people, it becomes undeniable. And I think the lessons of love and of being as loving as we can, and empathy, as well as being mindful of our actions, because we will, and not necessarily for the consequence, because religion is very much, I think, gifts and punishment. You will either be rewarded or you will be punished, and either action will fall into one of those categories. But I think it's more from a we are connected point of view. So then you recognize yourself in others, so you want to do right by them. I would tend to say that you feel less inclined to hurt them, or you're able to stop yourself if you feel like you're in the midst of it, you're angry and you're yelling at somebody. I think it has all these downstream positive effects for everybody that comes in contact with NDE stories, that I love that the whole field in itself is getting more and more attention nowadays, which is amazing.
Yeah, I agree.
Dr. Holden, thank you so much for being here today. It's been so interesting understanding more about your research, about how do we think of NDEs and what the data shows us. For everybody that wants to know more about you and your work or wants to get in touch, how can they do that?
Well, I do have a website. It's janholden.com. So it's pretty easy to remember, just my name, all lowercase letters. And also, my email address is jan.holden@UNT, that stands for University of North Texas, UNT.edu.